So let me kick this off with just a question to you guys. I want to get you to know a little bit better. Who here lives and works in this beautiful city? All right, awesome. Plenty of you. I think you guys are really, really lucky. I think this is actually one of the best cities to live in the entire world today. And I thought, kind of as I was preparing, I thought I'm going to share this story. This picture was taken by a childhood friend of mine just earlier this month. And it shows downtown Warsaw, just a few blocks from our middle school. And I distinctly remember that as we were starting the middle school, we would go out on the soccer pitch almost every break, every day, between every lesson, to play soccer, like many kids do. And it was the very center of Warsaw, and I remember that we would look around, and it felt like you were in the country. There was nothing around, maybe an apartment complex or two. But fast forward, as we were graduating the school, we were at the exact same field, and we would look around, and we were surrounded by skyscrapers. And it was just crazy how quickly the city is developing. It was crazy what change is happening. So with that, I'm just really happy to be back, and I wanted to say thank you to all of you guys for being here, working here, and making the city great. So thanks a lot. Yay. I should also say I'm from Warsaw, so really care about the city. So anyways, this is the closing talk, and it's going to be a very different kind of talk than most other presentations that you saw during the last 2 days. It's my first time at the Agile conference, so you'll see that clearly. But I was thinking, what can I share that would create value for you guys? And the topic of the presentation is startups versus corporate America, lessons learned. It's not going to be a direct comparison between startups and corporations. I think it would be pretty boring if I did that. But what I'm going to do is share some of the insights and some of the learnings informed by these two environments. So informed by some of the organizations that I helped to fund, some of the organizations, some of the startups that I helped to advise, and informed by my work at Google. So the main goal for me would be to create value for you guys, as I said, share the insights that would help you to avoid some of the mistakes I made, and hopefully some of that, I think we all strive for excellence, so some of that will help you to kind of accelerate that process. But before I jump into the lessons themselves, I thought it would make sense to share a little bit about my learning environment. So the first one is TEDx Warsaw. Has any of you guys heard about TEDx Warsaw before? It's not bad. So exactly 10 years ago, with a couple of friends, we started a conference called TEDx Warsaw. And our mission was to create a platform that would allow us to highlight all the innovation in technology, entertainment, and design that our city and our country were so rapidly creating. And so we came up with this idea that it would be great to bring the TED format to Central Eastern Europe and position it in its natural center, which was Warsaw. And in fact, that conference was supposed to be called TEDdy, like a teddy bear, for TED Eastern Europe. I don't think I ever shared that story publicly. So as we were ramping up to launch TEDdy, we learned that TED announced the TEDx program. So TEDx was the independently organized TED event. And for us, it was serendipity. It was exactly the format that we were looking for. So long story short, soon after, we were in charge of one of the first TEDx events in Europe and one of the first TEDx events in the world. And it was a great learning experience. The main thing that we learned is how much can be accomplished by a small team. For the first couple of years, it was literally 3 of us, then 6 of us, very, very small team. And TEDx became, in our eyes, a pretty large success. I think we reached about 40,000 people every year tuning in to watch us live, and really amazing speakers and really amazing folks of the audience. So I really enjoyed kind of keeping myself busy at that time. And a couple of years later, started another organization that was very dear to me. It was called the King's Foundation. And the mission for that organization, it was an educational nonprofit, was to break the glass ceiling syndrome that a lot of kids have. So the idea was, there are so many gifted kids in Poland, and at the same time, I learned that there's a bunch of students and alumni at the best universities in the world. And what was common across all these people was that these students and alumni, they knew how hard it was for them to convince themselves that they are good enough, they are smart enough to go into one of these top universities. So a lot of people would often ask themselves, like, am I good enough to go to Harvard? Isn't it going to be too difficult at Cambridge? How can I even get to a place like Imperial College? And those students and alumni, they ask those questions themselves, but they find answers. They give it a try. They find a way to get there. So what we built was a network of about 200 ambassadors, those students and alumni, who are mentoring and coaching kids from Warsaw, and in order to help them to get into these top schools. They were helping them to write essays. They were just navigating them through the process. And it actually worked out really well. We helped tens of kids and really enjoyed doing so. But the biggest lesson that I learned there, which is what I also referred to in the panel before, is the importance of incentives and understanding everyone's incentives. So you can imagine that this network of ambassadors that we had was about 200 of really high achievers, people whose plate was super busy, super full. So it took us a while to figure out how do we make them care? How do we make them invested in the effort? Which is something that's also going to surface in some lessons that I'm going to share with you later. And that basically brought me to the present day, which is where I've been living for the last 5 years, and that's San Francisco Bay Area, which you might also know as Silicon Valley. How many of you have ever been to Silicon Valley? Why? I say half, probably. So Silicon Valley is this really narrow strip of land with San Francisco in the north and San Jose in the south. And then there is a bunch of small towns in between, and they are really small. For example, Mountain View with Google is about 80,000 people, which, by the way, I think over half now works at Google. And there's a bunch of other cities, Cupertino with Apple, Palo Alto with Stanford. But what is incredible about this place is the culture. I think all great cities or all great places in the world are defined by its cultures. So the culture in Silicon Valley is a culture of sort of constant development, constant brainstorming. So you go into any coffee shop, any restaurant, and every conversation that you hear is about the next big thing, about what someone is working on, about disrupting industry, or about technical challenges. There are so many algorithmic discussions that I heard in coffee shops. So Silicon Valley was also an interesting time for me because it was a transition from smaller organizations that I've been doing here, whether it was TEDx Warsaw or the King's Foundation or some other startups that I was helping with, to a large organization. And that was a very interesting transition because you come from a place where you literally know the dates of everyone's birthdays on your team to a place that had 20,000 people when I started at Google, just in Mountain View. And now it's way bigger. So there are some similarities and some differences. One of the key things that I noticed is I was going from organizations that were really focused on just one product. So whether it was our conference or it was our mentoring program, to a place that was focused on a breadth of products, really many products. So a lot of people don't realize, because people think Google, they think the search engine, maybe Gmail, maybe Google Maps. But there's so many other products that the company is working on, whether it's YouTube or Android or cloud or hardware business, et cetera, et cetera. So it was really interesting to see how the company can still do well and be focused on so many things at a time. But the similarity I saw between this and my startup days was that actually when you zoom in and you look at all these different product areas, so whether it's YouTube or Android, et cetera, they operate almost like separate startups within Google, and they are very focused on what they are doing. So one of the things I mentioned is this breadth of opportunities at the large company, and this is particularly true for product managers, so folks similar to me. It's also very true for engineers. You can very, very easily switch jobs, and that's because usually it's enough to have a high-level understanding of something, and then sort of you learn on the job. It's a little bit harder for researchers or data scientists, but still pretty easy. So for me, I was very fortunate. I got to work on 3 products. The first one was Google Fit. So I was the founding member of Google Fit, which is a fitness app for your phone and for your smartwatch. Then I went to work on hardware business, Chromebooks. And I was in charge of the consumer Chromebook business worldwide. And that basically consisted of managing the portfolio of hardware devices, as well as managing all the business around it. And you will later see kind of the link to that and a couple of lessons that I learned there. And my last project where I am right now is sort of the core business that Google is doing, which is Google Ads. It's one of the fastest growing verticals within Google Ads, but it's also a very interesting experience because you find yourself in a place that serves three types of users. Normal users, like ourselves, advertisers, and publishers. So it's a really interesting distribution of power. So kind of 3 projects in 5 years, is that a lot or not? I think it's not that a lot, because when you look at the industry, I'm kind of curious if it's the same here in Europe, but especially in the United States and in Silicon Valley, usually you stay in a job for about 2 years, maybe 1.5 years, maybe 2.5 years, something like that. So at any given point in time, you're either in a place where you just started a job, or you're just about to change jobs, and you're starting to think about it. And because of that, I get a lot of questions from other PMs about how do you really choose your next job, whether it's a new company as a startup, or how do you choose a job within a large company. And what I usually share is what worked very well for me and for a couple of my friends. And it's a framework that consists of thinking and looking at 2 things, product and the team. And really in the product, it's sort of looking at 2 axes. The first one is the impact that your product is going to make a company and you can make on the product. And the other one is passion, whether you're passionate on the product, about the product. So with the impact, it is actually really interesting because you can measure it in so many different ways, right? It could be what revenue you're going to generate, how many users you're going to acquire, et cetera, et cetera. But what I think is very often confusing is people not looking at the potential impact of the product, but looking at the priority of the product. I think that was mentioned also in the panel that we just had. So the priority of the product can be really misleading because the current priority, I think, is just a reflection of the available information and also the ability of a manager to pitch it well. So you can end up with products that are not that impactful, but are at the very top of the priority list. And I can give you one good example from my own life where looking at the priority of the project would have been really bad, but looking at the impact worked out really well. So it was at a time when I was exiting, like leaving Google Fit, and I was thinking about my next challenge. And I looked into the platforms and ecosystems org. And that was the org that had Android OS, it had the Nexus phones at the time, Chromecast, a bunch of other products that were doing very well, and Chromebooks. And Chromebooks are actually at the very bottom of that priority list. The last couple of quarters, there wasn't any growth. And in general, it wasn't like a lot of people cared about that product at the time. But instead of looking at the priority and getting discouraged by that, I looked at the potential impact that I can make on this product. And if I make the product on, impact on this product and it starts to grow, what impact could it have on Google's business? And that was a very effective strategy. So very fast, immediately, I realized what can be improved in the product portfolio and also in the way we run the business. Sort of long story short, we joined the team, we kind of changed the team a little bit, and within 2 quarters, we started to grow 30%, then 40%, then 50%. And eventually, as I was leaving the team, we were doubling the sales. And it was just, and it also caused that the priority of Chromebooks kept increasing. So I think it's a really important lesson to just think about the impact, right? Don't get discouraged with the current priority. The other thing is, as I said, in product, it's impact and how passionate you are about the product. So if you asked me a year ago or 2 years ago, I would probably tell you that passion has nothing to do with how successful you can be with a product, because I didn't really care about that at that time. But what I learned over time is being passionate about, you can be passionate about the product, but even more importantly, being passionate about the product area is a really good insurance policy. Because products launch, but they also get delayed and they get canceled very often. So being passionate about the area, the entire area that your product is at, is a great insurance policy if your particular product is getting canceled and you have to pick up some other work. And then you can work on something that you're excited about. So it's the product, and then there's also the team. So a really interesting psychological thing is that very often we get so fixated about the product that we want to work on that we actually forget about the team, or we don't want to think about the team. We're kind of trying to squash that in our minds. So we just think, okay, it's gonna work itself out. The product is great. The team is whatever. But I think it's very irresponsible because a bad team can actually cause the product to fail, and it can cause a lot of frustration. And when I talk about the team, it's really the manager and the rest of the team. So obviously, you have to make sure that the team you're going to be working with is going to be great. But what a lot of people, especially more junior managers, forget about is the importance of the manager. And that's something that's sort of an advice that I very often give to PMs that just joined Google, which is your manager is going to be a single most important person in your workplace. That's the person who's going to define ultimately the scope of your work. That's the person who's ultimately going to evaluate your work. And that's the person who can open a lot of doors and advocate for you. So just to sum it up, I think when you're thinking about changing a job, and you're probably thinking about changing a job now, think about the product and think about the team. Don't forget about the team. And that brings us to the actual lessons. When I first joined Google, my designer was the guy who invented hashtag on Twitter. And my tech lead was the previous CTO of Napster, if you remember Napster. What it shows is that people in Silicon Valley move a lot. And I think people in our industry move a lot. So the relationships you make now, these people are going to spread across the industry. And in a large company, they're all over the place at Google, but they're also going to go to other startups and other companies. So it's really important to remember that. And one actually interesting stat that I recently saw. I looked at how many people joined Google after I joined. And I realized that it's 80%. So 80% joined Google after me. It's a huge percentage. And I think that's because the company has been growing a lot, but I think it's also because of the breadth of opportunities and the fact that people move a lot. This is further fueled by the fact that in our industry, and especially in a place like Bay Area, you bump into people all the time on the weekends and social occasions, et cetera, et cetera. So what are 2 things that I would recommend to really take advantage of the fact that essentially in our industry, everyone knows everyone, and everyone moves all the time. The first one is to build real relationships. And that sounds very trivial, but I found that very often we get lost in the daily hustle. So we have our deadlines, we have our projects, we have our deliverables, there are some tight timelines, and we tend to focus too much on work and not actually on building these relationships with people. I did the opposite when I was in Google Fit, and looking back, I know that I made a lot of product decisions for Google Fit. I can't recall any specific decision. I know that I went to plenty of reviews for that product, but I don't remember the particulars. But what I remember is the relationships I built with that team, because then I invested in them over time. These people are all over at Google and in the industry, and I leveraged these relationships since then. What I also want to say is, when I say build real relationships, that real is, I think, really important. I don't think it's worth to be this annoying networking person who goes to every conference, every event, and hands the business card. I believe in building the real relationships, which I think you build by creating value for other people. So I think that idea of creating value was kind of highlighted very well in the panel we had. I believe that the best way to create value for someone is through work, or through interactions, or through introductions. The second thing that I think is really important, given the industry we're in, is to find yourself mentors and sponsors. I think it's very silly not to take advantage or not to leverage the great advice and example that we have in our industry, looking at mentors or sponsors. Mentor, which I think that mentorship is a very trendy and very popular thing these days. So who is a mentor? Like, mentor is someone who is able to commit their time to better you, and usually share their experience. The thing is, it's a relatively cheap level of commitment, I believe, although it's so ubiquitous and everyone has a mentor or is a mentor. What I think is far more valuable is finding yourself a sponsor. So sponsor, on the contrary, is someone who is willing to bet on you, who's willing to advocate on you, and who will ultimately set you up for success. And that's the relationship you really want to have. I benefited a lot in my career from sponsors. And I think it always has to, your talents and your strengths have to come together with having a strong sponsor who's going to set you up for success. Now, I had a conversation recently with one of the PMs at Google who asked, like, hey, how do I really get a sponsor? Like, these are usually people who are in the position of power, their plate is full, and they usually have plenty of people who want their advice and their mentorship and their sponsorship. And I think that surfaces another problem, which there are people who know about sponsors, but they just don't know how to start. They don't know how to make the sponsors care and invest in them. And my answer here is, again, I think it comes down to creating value. So try to be helpful, but don't ask for anything in return. At least that's what I've always done. So how do you create a value for someone who potentially has everything or has access to a lot of things? So I find that, first of all, if your sponsor is from a different industry, it's really valuable if you can share insights from your industry. If it's the same industry, then it's valuable to share insights from your age group or from your community. And last but not least, what I find very useful is making introductions to your sponsors. So if your sponsor is interested in you, chances are it's a person who's interested in young, dynamic people, high achievers who are doing well, and chances are they are interested in more people like that. Chances also are that you know these kind of people. So it's a very straightforward way to build that connection with your sponsor. But it's important, I think, not to ask for anything in return. If the sponsor is the right person, then they are going to generate value for you that is far greater than what you would originally ask for. The second lesson is about the DNA, and your product having a DNA of your organization. So a question that I often ask at Google to candidates is, you're a PM at Google, how would you design X? And the X changes and varies all the time. It could be a cryptocurrency wallet, it could be a dating app, it could be anything else. It doesn't really matter. So you'd be surprised how many people take this and they totally discard the first sentence, and they only treat this as a design exercise. They design in vacuum, and they design something that doesn't have any identity. And look, I know that you can design a cryptocurrency wallet. We wouldn't even be having that conversation, that interview, if you didn't know how to design a cryptocurrency wallet. What I'm interested in is whether you can design something that's going to leverage what our organization is uniquely great at to your advantage. Right? So why is that important? It's important because if you can't do that, then you put yourself at a competitive disadvantage, and you put your organization at a competitive disadvantage. It's important because then you don't know how to harvest the resources that your organization is providing. But I think the worst is that if you don't do it, you might design something that is not aligned with the mission of your company. And that could be really bad. So what are the sort of tactics that you can use to make sure that your product is going to actually have the DNA of your organization? I think first of all is figure out what your organization is uniquely great at. So in the context of Google, it's really straightforward, right? It's organizing and indexing information, it's cloud computing, and it's AI. There are plenty more things, but like these are top of mind. You know, we actually went through that exercise also when we were at TEDx Warsaw. We were doing pretty well. We're happy with how things are going. So we're thinking about branching out, doing other things. But did we think about starting a podcast? No. Or did we start a magazine? No. We thought about what we are good at, what we are uniquely positioned to do well, and that was organizing a conference. So instead of starting something completely new, we started something that we knew that we can execute on very well, and that was sister conferences. So we started TEDx Youth at Warsaw and a bunch of other events. That opened up different age groups for us, different users, new demographic, that eventually graduated and became the audience for TEDx Warsaw. And that's only because we didn't just work on what we thought would be cool to do, but we focused on our strengths. The second thing is to stay true to the mission of your organization. I think if you don't do that, in the short term, it might work out. But in the long term, it's going to clash. Having one mission and all products aligned on that mission makes it, first of all, it unites the team. But secondly, it makes it much easier to prioritize and allocate resources. So I think a great example of a new product that recently launched and is very aligned with the company's mission is Google Photos. So overall mission of Google is to organize the world's information and make it accessible to everyone. Google Photos, what they did was creating a product that would organize your photos and make it easily accessible to you on your phone. And they did that using what Google was uniquely great at, which was cloud for photo storage and AI to make it easily accessible and searchable. And because it was designed that way, it really resonated with a lot of people at Google and also with a lot of users. And it was a huge success. So I think it's a textbook example of how to design a product from scratch. This is going to be a slightly controversial insight, I think. And we mentioned this in the panel, just briefly. But I think there's this trend recently to focus actually too much on weaknesses and on improving weaknesses. So very often, you have an engineer who starts on a project, they work on something, they acquire a skill, they get a batch of accomplishment, and then they move on and they are placed on another project that they don't know nothing about, and they have to learn from scratch. It's to the point where some managers actually would only allocate people, at least in Silicon Valley, would allocate people who don't have a certain skill to a project that requires that skill so that they can learn. I think that this is wasteful and irresponsible, and it puts a lot of stress on that employee, because that employee cannot leverage the strengths he or she has. But I don't want to say I'm against self-development and development in general, improvement. I think this is a really important part of your work, but I don't think it should be the sort of core of what you're working on. So what are some tactics for a manager to make sure that they focus on the strengths and they don't put the employee in a position like that? The first one is to really deeply understand your strengths and the strengths of people on your team. If you know that, you can allocate the work really well, and you maximize the efficiency of your team. And you just make your team, in general, happier. The other thing is, you should lead by example. And a lot of managers, and especially in large companies, they forget about it. They delegate too much, they over-delegate, and what that does is it destroys the team morale. If the team doesn't see the leader of the project putting an extra effort, extra mile, it could have really bad impact on the team performance. But these are pretty straightforward things. One more thing that I wanted to share that I think is really important in this context is the importance of incentives. I mentioned it before. I think it's absolutely critical for you as a manager to understand the incentives of people on your team, what they are motivated by, where they are driven by. Is it a promotion? Is it more scope? Is it overcoming a technical challenge? Is it more visibility? Only if you align the strengths with the features that the team needs to work on, with incentives, you're going to get a very efficient team that is producing high-quality work. Have you guys ever heard someone saying that in a corporation, in a large company, you're just a small gear in a big machinery, and you're not going to have any significant impact? I actually hear that all the time from the recruiters. A common pitch to work at a startup is, look, join our startup. We are a small, nimble team. You're going to have plenty of impact. And impact became actually the most common currency these days for pitching stuff. It's sort of a less riskier version of success, because you can't guarantee success, but you can guarantee that someone's going to have a lot of impact. Well, to be honest, the impact, the way I define it, is what is the potential that you have, and what is your kind of desirability to make it happen. So when you think about the potential, I think it's really a result of what your creativity is with what your strengths are and what your talents are. So essentially, do you have an idea and do you have traits to execute on it? And there's the determination, which is, are you determined enough to figure out a way to convince your organization to work on this? And if you look at this from this lens, then suddenly I think the size of the organization happens much less. I think what matters more is whether you are able to figure out how does your organization really work. And in a startup environment, it could be more straightforward, because startups have a smaller team, they have less workflows, and it's a little bit easier to figure out what the distribution of power is. So it becomes much natural to us to figure out how to get resources for our project and how to get a feature prioritized and people to work on it. In a larger organization, it's much more nuanced. So you have usually, it usually takes more time to figure out what is the distribution of power, who is actually allocated the budget, who is making decisions, what resonates with people, and how to pitch stuff. So because of that, a lot of people make that connection that it's much more difficult, or you can't have a lot of impact at a startup. So I can give you an example of how you can actually make a significant impact in a large company. When I first joined Chrome OS, I got to work on one device for emerging markets. It's a very small project. And I was actually one of 3 PMs on that project. Really, really small impact. But I took that time to figure out, essentially, how does the organization work? Who makes the decisions? Who allocates the budget? What metrics do people look at? And how can I use my strengths to position myself best? And once we launched that device, I was able to position myself in a way that I started to lead the Chrome OS business in Latin America. And that was great, because for the first time, I had a direct line of communication with these executives who managed the budget. So I was able to show them my vision, use my determination, convince them to some of the ideas I had, and they happened to work out. And about 6 months later, I was promoted, and I was in charge of the consumer Chromebook business worldwide. And that was a much bigger business. The impact was about $500 million in sales. And this is I'm kind of living example of if you really take time to figure out the processes and the distribution of power and how really your organization works, you can have plenty of impact even at a larger company. So I was at a dinner party 2 weeks ago, and I overheard a conversation between 2 friends of mine, and both were startup founders, talking about their companies. And they were exchanging information how well their startups are doing. One of them said, "Hey, we're doing really well. We have 10 employees." The other one was like, "Hey, I mean, that's great. We have 8, but we are growing really fast. We're soon going to be 9, 10, 11. And that was a very characteristic conversation for Silicon Valley. And I think for our industry in general, sort of the number of people and hiring became the new metric of success for your company. So you're no longer talking about profit or revenue or the number of users, but more and more often you're talking about how many people are on your team and how quickly you're growing. And I made that mistake myself. I'm guilty of that too. When we were working at the King's Foundation, we would very often say, we're doing great. We have 50 ambassadors, 100 ambassadors, 200 ambassadors. But I think that's not really the right thing, the right way of doing things. So it's also this is also a problem in large companies, not just startups. In large companies, and especially in a place like Silicon Valley, there's abundance of resource. There's plenty of talent, and companies are competing for that talent to scoop it off the market and just have it on their side. And once they hire the candidate, very often there wouldn't be a job immediately for that person. So they are putting these people on teams. Teams get overstaffed, they get too big, and people get frustrated, and the quality of work goes down. It's a problem there too. So, to be honest, Google is doing quite a good job at this. It's not perfect. One example from the beginning of my career at Google was Google Fit, as I said. The project was really hot. I think it still is hot. There are many people in our industry who are passionate about fitness and moving and being active. So the project was very popular. And we got plenty of engineers who wanted to work on it right away, and we hired all of them, and we were building an app. So we had all these people to build just a small app. And that was a mistake, because if you're in that position, then your roadmap is growing. That you keep adding features just so that people can work on something. And that slowed us down. So what we are doing in ads these days is we're trying to keep our team super small, super nimble, always trying to be just a little bit understaffed, and that is working out for us really, really well. So I just want to end with one bonus lesson. And this is something that I mentioned to you guys during the panel, is this book that was recently published. It's called It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work by Jason Fried and David Heinemeier Hansen, founders of Basecamp. This book talks about something that I think a lot of people in our industry struggle with, which is the work environment, the workplace being too stressful, constant distractions, meetings that are composed of, days that are composed of 10 meetings or more with lunch in between, and then end of day. This is particularly true for product managers who are even expected to be taking meetings. But I think it's a really big problem in our industry. And sort of one lesson here that is in the book, and I really encourage you guys to read the book, is that you should take the ownership of your time. Don't let other people manage your calendar. Don't necessarily believe that you can do great work in small increments of time, like 30 minutes of time. Great work usually requires larger chunks of time. I myself block 2 or 3 hours a day to just creatively work, basically every day. You have to know your style. I am very productive in the mornings, so my mornings are usually just big blocks of time where I don't take any meetings. I only take meetings in the afternoon. Also, people are lazy in general. So a lot of people, they don't want to do the work, and they're going to schedule a meeting so that someone else can do the work for them. So be careful for that. I actually don't accept any meeting that where a prep work or a homework wasn't done before, and that doesn't have a clear decision point that we would have to do during that meeting. Also, if someone schedules a 30-minute meeting with you, chances are that either it's not enough time to get something done, and you really require 1 hour, or that this decision could have been made over email. So it's a colossal waste of time for everyone there. Cool, so that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for your attention. Hope it was interesting for you guys. I'm sure it was very different to all other talks you had at this conference, but I love to connect with people. So if you have any questions or you wanted to connect, please shoot me an email. And thanks so much.